In the summer of 1926, the largest freshwater lake on Earth briefly gave up one of its secrets. For a moment, something impossible stood exposed beneath the waters of Lake Superior. Witnesses described a massive stone formation unlike anything they had expected to find. And then, just 62 hours later, it was gone. Not hidden, not submerged. Gone. The official explanations never fully satisfied those who saw it. The photographs became difficult to find. The records grew strangely quiet, and the question remained. What did Lake Superior reveal in 1926 that disappeared before the world could understand it? If you are fascinated by forgotten discoveries, buried history, and mysteries that refuse to stay buried, subscribe now to Lost Secret Timeline, because some secrets are lost by time. Others are removed from it. Lake Superior does not surrender its secrets easily, stretching across the northern edge of the United States and deep into Canada. It is a body of water so vast that standing on its shoreline often feels like staring at an ocean. The lake has swallowed ships, erased evidence, preserved mysteries beneath cold, dark depths for generations. For centuries, people believed its hidden world would remain untouched. Then came the summer of 1926. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The communities surrounding the lake moved through their routines as they always had. Fishing boats left harbor before sunrise. Cargo vessels crossed familiar routes. Tourists gathered along rocky shorelines. But beneath the surface, conditions were changing. Reports began circulating among local mariners. Water levels appeared lower than expected. Shorelines extended farther than normal. Exposed rock formations appeared where open water should have been. Most people dismissed it as a temporary fluctuation. After all, lakes rise and fall. Nature changes. Nothing unusual about that. Yet, as the days passed, the retreat became impossible to ignore. Veteran fishermen who had spent decades on Lake Superior claimed they were seeing terrain that had never been visible in their lifetimes. Entire stretches of submerged ground emerged from the water. Ancient rock shelves surfaced. New pathways appeared along the shoreline. Then one morning, observers noticed something else. Something that did not resemble a natural formation. Something geometric. Something structured. Far from shore, where open water should have existed, a shape emerged from the retreating lake. At first, it looked like a line. Then a ridge, then something much more unsettling. Because, as more of it became visible, witnesses realized they were not looking at a random arrangement of stone. They were looking at what appeared to be a wall, and that was only the beginning. The first people to see it were not archaeologists. They were fishermen. Men who had spent years navigating the waters of Lake Superior. Men who knew every familiar rock, every dangerous shoal, every stretch of shoreline that appeared and disappeared with the seasons. That was why they immediately understood something was wrong. Early one morning, as the sun pushed through a layer of fog hanging low over the lake, several fishermen noticed an unusual shape emerging from the water. At first they assumed it was a natural ridge exposed by the receding lake level. But the closer they moved, the stranger it became. The formation stretched far longer than expected. Its edges appeared unusually straight. Its surface seemed organized rather than random. One fisherman later described it as looking less like a cliff and more like something that had been built. Word spread quickly. Dock workers abandoned their tasks. Local residents gathered along the shoreline. Small boats began moving toward the site throughout the day. Everyone wanted a closer look. As more of the structure emerged, the details became impossible to ignore. Massive blocks of stone appeared stacked in long sections. Some sections seemed aligned with remarkable precision. Observers reported gaps that resembled entrances or passageways. Others claimed portions of the wall appeared layered, as if constructed in stages. The formation rose several feet above the exposed lake bed. In some places, shadows suggested additional sections remained buried beneath sediment. Many who saw it struggled to explain what they were looking at. Some insisted it was a rare geological formation. Others disagreed immediately. Nature, they argued, could create strange shapes, but not shapes like these. Not with lines so deliberate, not with angles so consistent, not with an appearance that seemed almost architectural. By sunset, hundreds of people had heard the rumors, and as darkness settled across Lake Superior, one unsettling possibility began spreading through the nearby towns. What if the lake had not revealed a natural formation at all? What if it had revealed something built by human hands? By the following morning, the discovery was no longer a local curiosity. It had become the only thing people were talking about. The small communities surrounding Lake Superior awoke to rumors that something extraordinary had emerged from the water. At first, many dismissed the stories. A wall beneath the lake. A structure where no structure should exist. It sounded impossible. Yet as the hours passed, more witnesses arrived. Farmers left their fields. Shop owners closed early. Families traveled from neighboring towns. The shoreline became crowded with people hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious formation for themselves. Some arrived skeptical. Few left that way. The structure was impossible to ignore. From a distance, it appeared as a dark line stretching across the exposed lake bed. Up close, observers described rows of stone that seemed strangely deliberate. The longer people looked, the less natural it appeared. Then came the photographs. Several visitors reportedly carried portable cameras to the site. Throughout the day, images were allegedly taken from boats, shorelines, and elevated ridges, overlooking the exposed formation. Witnesses later claimed photographers carefully documented the wall from multiple angles. Some believed the pictures would soon appear in newspapers across the region. Others assumed scientists would arrive and finally explain what everyone was seeing. But as excitement grew, so did speculation. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some claimed the wall was part of a forgotten settlement lost beneath the lake centuries earlier. Others whispered that it might predate any known civilization in the region. A few even suggested it was evidence of a chapter of history that had somehow vanished from official records. Every new witness seemed to bring a new theory. Every theory made the mystery larger. By evening, the discovery had become something more than a strange geological curiosity. It had become a story powerful enough to attract attention far beyond the small towns surrounding Lake Superior. And somewhere beyond the crowds and rumors, people in positions of authority were beginning to hear about it. The next visitors would not come out of curiosity. They would come with questions, and soon with orders. On the third day, the atmosphere around the site began to change. The crowds were still there. The rumors were still spreading. But now, new faces had arrived. Men carrying measuring equipment, tripods, surveying instruments, field notebooks. Unlike the curious locals gathering along the shoreline, these visitors came with a purpose. They were engineers, surveyors, and technical specialists tasked with examining the strange formation that had suddenly become the center of attention. Throughout the morning, small teams moved carefully across the exposed lakebed. Witnesses watched as measurements were taken from multiple points along the structure. Distances were recorded. Elevations were noted. Sketches filled notebook pages. The experts appeared determined to document every visible detail. At first, many expected a simple explanation. Perhaps the formation was an unusual rock shelf, a natural ridge shaped by centuries of erosion, a geological anomaly that only looked artificial from a distance. But as inspections continued, confidence seemed to fade. The structure displayed characteristics that were difficult to ignore. Sections appeared remarkably straight. Certain angles repeated with surprising consistency. Large stone blocks seemed arranged in patterns that suggested purpose rather than chance. Several observers later recalled seeing surveyors repeatedly checking the same measurements, as if trying to confirm what they were seeing. The numbers, whatever they were, appeared to raise more questions than answers. By afternoon, discussions among the specialists grew noticeably more serious. Groups gathered around maps. Quiet conversations replaced casual observations. The formation was no longer being treated as a curiosity. It was becoming a problem, because if the structure was natural, it was unlike anything most of them had encountered before. And if it was not natural, an even larger question emerged. Who built it? No known records described a massive stone structure beneath Lake Superior. No local histories mentioned it. No official surveys had ever identified it. Yet there it stood, visible to anyone willing to look. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, one fact became impossible to ignore. The experts had arrived expecting answers. Instead, they had uncovered a mystery that seemed to deepen with every measurement they took, and soon their findings would attract attention from far higher levels. By now, what stood before them could no longer be dismissed as a simple geological formation. The more carefully it was studied, the more it resisted explanation. Survey teams moved along its length, expecting irregular stone, fractured rock, and natural erosion patterns. Instead, they found something that felt deliberately arranged. The surface of the structure was uneven in a way that suggested age, but its layout told a different story. Large stone blocks appeared positioned in sequences that repeated with unusual consistency, not randomly scattered, not collapsed, but aligned. Some sections formed long, uninterrupted lines that stretched further than visibility allowed. Others seemed to intersect at angles that felt too precise to be accidental. Observers began pointing out patterns, parallel formations running side by side, edges that appeared almost straight when viewed from certain positions, corners that seemed to meet with a kind of engineered precision. It was this precision that created the growing unease among those examining it, because nature rarely behaves with such intention. Rock formations fracture. They erode. They collapse under pressure and time. But what lay beneath Lake Superior's exposed bed seemed to resist that logic entirely. Even more disturbing were the repeating sections that appeared mirrored across different points. Stone layers that seemed to follow a structured rhythm, as if guided by an unseen blueprint. One engineer reportedly remarked that the formation did not behave like a natural deposit at all. It behaved like a design, a deliberate one. But if that was true, then the implications were far greater than anyone present was prepared to accept, because nothing in the official geological record of the region accounted for structures of this scale or precision, and nothing in known history placed human construction anywhere near this part of Lake Superior in antiquity. Yet here it was, measured, photographed, and increasingly difficult to explain away. As the sun moved lower in the sky, conversations among the experts grew quieter, not because answers were being found, but because every measurement seemed to remove one more possibility of a simple explanation. And the question that now hung over the entire site was no longer what they were looking at. It was how something like this had ever been hidden beneath the surface of a lake so heavily studied for centuries. It began with the sound of engines long before anyone saw the vehicles. Late in the afternoon, a line of official transport arrived along the dirt roads leading toward the shoreline. Dark cars, unmarked trucks, men who did not speak to the crowd. At first, locals assumed it was part of the ongoing investigation. More experts, more measurements, more explanations. But something about this arrival felt different. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the wind along the shoreline seemed to carry a heavier silence. Within minutes, the newly arrived personnel moved decisively toward the site. They did not request permission. They issued instructions. Survey teams that had spent days documenting the structure were told to step back. Civilians were ordered away from the shoreline. Access points were established within hours. Boundaries were drawn across the exposed lake bed, as if the land itself had been reassigned. Witnesses later described seeing barriers placed where none had existed before. And then came the most unsettling part. The explanations were minimal. No detailed public statement. No clarification. Only control. The structure that had drawn hundreds of observers was now being guarded as if it required protection from the public itself. Some locals attempted to ask questions. None received answers. Others tried to remain nearby, hoping to continue observing from a distance. They were escorted away. By evening, the once crowded shoreline had been transformed into a restricted zone. What had started as a discovery accessible to anyone willing to look was now something no one was allowed to approach freely. Even the experts who had spent days analyzing the formation appeared uncertain about their new role. Some were seen leaving with notes and equipment sealed away. Others remained behind under supervision. And through it all, the structure itself remained visible in the distance, silent, unexplained, now surrounded not by curiosity, but by authority. And as night approached, one question began spreading quietly among those who had been removed from the site. If nothing was wrong with what they had found, why was it suddenly being controlled so tightly? No one at the shoreline knew the exact moment the countdown began. There was no announcement, no official briefing, no public statement marking the start of something irreversible. But inside the restricted perimeter, something changed. Orders began moving through the site in a faster rhythm. Personnel were repositioned. Equipment was relocated. Communication between teams became shorter, sharper, more controlled. Whatever uncertainty had existed earlier was replaced by urgency. A timeline had been set, and now everything was working against it. Witnesses who had been pushed beyond the barriers described seeing unusual activity through gaps in the fencing and along distant ridgelines. Trucks arrived and left in cycles that felt too organized to be random. Heavy machinery was positioned closer to the exposed formation. Covered materials were brought in under tight supervision. It no longer looked like observation. It looked like preparation. When locals tried to ask what was happening, they received the same answer each time. Nothing public, nothing confirmed, just instructions to remain at a distance. But those who had been closest to the original discovery began to notice something even more unsettling. The structure was no longer being treated as a mystery to study. It was being treated as something temporary, something that would not remain exposed for long. Then the phrase began circulating quietly among those still nearby. 62 hours. Not officially stated in public, not explained to civilians, but repeated in fragments of conversation between personnel moving through the site. 62 hours until what? No one said it directly, but the implication was clear enough. Whatever had been uncovered beneath Lake Superior was on a clock, and whatever decision had been made behind closed doors was already in motion. As night fell over the restricted shoreline, the site was no longer just guarded. It was active, controlled, and accelerating toward a conclusion that no longer felt avoidable, because now everyone who had seen even a glimpse of the structure understood the same unsettling truth. Something was about to happen to it, and there was very little time left to stop it. The morning arrived without warning, but the site was already awake before the sun fully rose. The restricted shoreline was no longer quiet. It was tense. Every movement felt calculated. Every instruction carried weight. Then, without ceremony, the final phase began. Witnesses positioned beyond the barriers later described hearing a sudden shift in the atmosphere and absence of noise that felt unnatural, as if even the lake itself had gone still. Seconds later, the first shockwave broke across the exposed basin. A deep, rolling blast echoed across the water. Then another, and another. Explosions were detonated along sections of the formation in a controlled sequence, each one sending bursts of debris into the air. Stone that had stood exposed for decades, maybe longer, according to some witnesses, began to fracture under force. Entire sections collapsed inward. Dust and spray mixed together as the structure started to disappear beneath repeated impacts. From a distance, observers could only watch in disbelief. Some shouted questions that were never answered. Others simply stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. The formation that had drawn engineers, surveyors, and authorities had become unrecognizable within minutes. What once appeared structured, deliberate, and impossibly precise was now breaking apart, under controlled destruction. Layer after layer vanished into the exposed lakebed. And then, as quickly as it began, the operation slowed. The final detonations echoed across Lake Superior, followed by an unsettling silence. When the dust finally settled, there was almost nothing left to identify. No clear outline, nor recognizable geometry. Only scattered remnants fading into the shoreline. Witnesses later described a feeling that was harder to explain than the destruction itself. Not just shock, but erasure, as if something had been removed not only from the landscape, but from possibility itself. And in that silence, one realization spread among those who had seen it firsthand. They had not just watched a structure collapse. They had watched something be made impossible to question ever again. In the days that followed, Lake Superior returned to its familiar state. The shoreline looked unchanged. The water moved, as it always had. To anyone passing by, there was no sign that anything extraordinary had ever happened there, at all. But for those who had witnessed the events, the silence that followed felt unnatural, almost intentional. Attempts to find official records of the discovery began almost immediately. Local archives were checked. Newspaper offices were contacted. Personal photographs were reviewed and compared. At first, there seemed to be fragments of confirmation, brief mentions in early notes, unfinished reports, references to unusual formations and temporary exposure of submerged structures. But the more people searched, the more inconsistencies appeared. Documents that should have contained detailed measurements were incomplete. Photographic records reportedly taken at the site became difficult to trace. Some accounts that had circulated locally began to contradict each other. Dates shifted slightly. Descriptions changed. Entire sections of testimony disappeared from later summaries. Even among those who had been present, memories began to diverge. Some insisted the structure had been natural. Others were certain it had been artificial. A few refused to discuss it at all. Official explanations, when they appeared, were minimal, carefully worded, vague enough to satisfy no one. And then, gradually, the story faded from public discussion, not through resolution, but through absence, as if attention itself had been redirected elsewhere. What remained was not clarity, but confusion, a growing sense that what had happened at Lake Superior did not simply end with destruction. It ended with removal. Removal from records, from photographs, from conversation, and eventually from collective memory. Yet for those few who still carried what they had seen in those brief 62 hours, one truth remained impossible to dismiss. Something had been there, something real, and whatever it was no longer meant to be found again. Today, Lake Superior holds no visible trace of what was once reported in those brief 62 hours. No marked location, no preserved structure, no official acknowledgement that anything unusual ever existed beneath its waters. But history is not always defined by what remains. Sometimes it is defined by what does not. And so the question lingers. What was really revealed in 1926? Was it a natural formation exposed by an unusual drop in water levels, later misunderstood by witnesses, overwhelmed by scale and conditions? Or was it something far more difficult to explain, something that did not fit within the boundaries of accepted history? Why did so many accounts describe precision where randomness should have been? Why do early descriptions mention structure, alignment, and geometry that seem inconsistent with natural erosion? And perhaps most importantly, why did the entire event fade so completely from documented history? These questions have no confirmed answers, only fragments, contradictions, and silence where clarity should exist. But this is not the only story of its kind. Across different places, in different times, similar patterns appear. Sudden discoveries, unusual formations, brief moments where something hidden becomes visible, only to disappear again before it can be fully understood. Some call these events coincidence, others call them misinterpretation, but a growing number of people see a different pattern emerging, a pattern of missing context, interrupted records, and histories that seem incomplete in ways that are difficult to ignore. Lake Superior becomes one chapter in that larger possibility, a reminder that beneath familiar landscapes, beneath what we believe is already known, there may still be stories waiting for the right moment to surface. And sometimes, when they do not stay long enough for the world to agree on what it saw, only long enough to raise a question that refuses to disappear. What else has been lost before we were allowed to understand it? Maybe the truth was buried beneath Lake Superior. Or maybe it was buried somewhere deeper in the parts of history we were never meant to question. If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe to Lost Secret Timeline and join us as we uncover the forgotten mysteries, hidden histories, and lost chapters that refuse to stay buried. Because the next secret timeline may already be waiting to surface.